Get full episodes of The Damage Report as a podcast on iTunes and Android, and you can watch the live show every weekday on YouTube TV. In the past few days, since the wave of attempted mail bombings and the shooting over the weekend of the Tree of Life Synagogue, Donald Trump has not wanted to take even one tiny shred of responsibility, either personally or as the figurehead of a party that has been stoking racial resentment and religious resentment and those sorts of things for as long as I've been alive. But it has accelerated in recent years, and he bristles at the very notion that anything he says could lead to this sort of violence. And in doing this, in attempting to defend himself, he is going to what I would classify as ridiculous lengths to both sides this issue. And last night he did an interview on Fox News with Laura Ingraham. Very, very bold of him to go before that firing squad of a reporter after this violence. But he was talking with her, and look at how he responds to the idea that he could in any way be responsible.
I was in the headline of the Washington Post, my name associated with this crazy bomber.
Al.
Trump bomber or something. But I was in the headline when they got him. They didn't say bomber found. They talked about Trump in the headline. Now, they didn't do that with Bernie Sanders when he had. They didn't do that with the Democrats when other people came out. They didn't do that with President Obama with the church, the horrible situation with the church. They didn't do that. They put my name in the headlines.
Okay, so there's like at least 4 ridiculous things fit in that 30-second clip. Hopefully I'll remember all of them. First of all, in terms of the media being willing to link him there, he says they didn't say bomber found, they said Trump. Well, they also said bomber found. I remember reporting on the fact that we talked about finding him. But in so doing, when we find out that he is one of the most enthusiastic Trump supporters that I think we've ever seen in this country, that seems kind of relevant. I feel like you should probably mention that. As I pointed out on Twitter, if it had been the other way, if he hadn't been a Trump supporter, but we found out that back in 1979, he donated $10 to the Sierra Club, Fox News would be calling for all Democrats to disavow their party. We know how that plays out. Instead, this guy is an obvious Trump supporter, an enthusiastic believer in the variety of conspiracy theories that Donald Trump and his supporters push on a daily basis, covered his van with Trump stickers and Trump posing on tanks and attacking all of the targets of Trump's ire on a daily basis, goes to Trump rallies, is holding up signs and all that. I think the media has an obligation to point that out. I know that Trump supporters don't like that realization, the idea that one of their own could do this sort of thing, because the vast, vast, vast majority of Trump supporters would never think of hurting another person, but it is the truth and we need to acknowledge that. And even though the media, as Trump is pointing out there, did acknowledge it, I have a question for you. We're a couple of days out from this guy being found, and we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was a Trump fanatic. What percentage of Trump supporters do you think accept that the bomber was a Trump fan? I'm really curious. Do you think that it's 100%? No, of course we don't think that it's 100%. Do you think half? Do you think 10%? Is it less than 10% accept what is obviously true? All the evidence shows that. And so he's frustrated with the media even attempting to get across that inconvenient truth to his fans. But I don't think he needs to worry, because I don't think they're gonna believe it anyway. So beyond that, beyond his frustration with the media, he tries to both sides in a number of different ways. He starts off with their go-to in this case, and that is Bernie Sanders. Now, of course, Steve Scalise was shot. He was shot by a guy that had volunteered on Bernie Sanders' campaign. Now, it's important to note at this point that literally anyone can volunteer for a political campaign. They weren't paying this guy. They didn't go out and headhunt for this guy. He wasn't a campaign chairman or something like that. He was a volunteer, but because he was a volunteer, after that shooting, Bernie Sanders came out and gave a speech saying that it was absolutely disgusting, he feels terrible, he disavows all political violence and all of that. And that message, I think, was very easy to buy, because Bernie Sanders has never once called for any form of violence of the sort that Donald Trump casually talks about at every one of his rallies. He's never done that. And much more importantly, and what makes this Steve Scalise, Bernie Sanders thing a ridiculous comparison to make in the light of all the political violence that we've had in this country over the past couple of weeks, is that Bernie Sanders does not talk about Steve Scalise. He does not give speeches about Steve Scalise. He doesn't do weird nicknames for him and talk about him constantly on Twitter and social media. He doesn't bring him up randomly at rallies to get applause lines. He hasn't done any of that stuff. If you were trying to put together some sort of enemies list for Bernie Sanders, Steve Scalise wouldn't make the top 200. And so it was a weird, random, and tragic form of political violence from a guy who was tangentially involved with Bernie Sanders. That is not the case with these mail bombings. These were exactly the people that Donald Trump talks about on a daily basis. He comes up with weird nicknames for them. He demonizes them on social media. He brings them up in rallies, all of the things I was just talking about. That is why there is a connection there. Whether you think that Donald Trump is responsible or not, certainly this guy was going after the people that Trump demonizes. That was not the case with Bernie Sanders and Steve Scalise. After trying to throw blame onto Bernie Sanders, he then says, this doesn't happen with other Democrats, which is not actually an example. It sounds like one, but he actually can't come up with another example of a Democrat, which is why he uses that vague language. I don't know what he's referring to, if he's referring to anything, in fact. But then he moves on to the most ridiculous one of all. Barack Obama didn't get blamed like this in the church shooting. Now, we are used to a lot of ridiculous statements by Donald Trump. Things have been normalized that I never thought would ever be normalized in this country, but that is one of the most, obviously, it's not just a stupid comment, it is a purposefully inflammatory, offensive, whatever word you want to use, thing to say about this. So, a white supremacist goes into a black church and shoots up the black congregants at that church, and Donald Trump says it's not fair that the media didn't blame Barack Obama for black people being shot up by a white supremacist. So this isn't a case where he has found sort of the inverse of what's going on with him and his supporters. This is the same thing as what's going on with him and his supporters. It's white supremacists acting out against perceived enemies, whether particular politicians, members of the media, or whole communities, if they're shooting up a synagogue, if they're shooting up a bunch of African Americans. So he is saying that Barack Obama, the first black president, should have been blamed, should have gotten some of the blame for a white supremacist choosing to target black Christians. That is not just absurd, that is horrendous. And he knows that Barack Obama never did anything to lead to that sort of violence. He was constantly a figure giving high-profile speeches attempting to bring together races and get rid of some of that strife. Something that, of course, is not his responsibility to do. He inherited a country at that time that had hundreds of years of horrendous racism and violence in basically one direction. And he was expected by the other side, which wins elections based on those sorts of racists, to heal all of those wounds, which is ridiculous. But in fact, President Barack Obama, after that shooting, sang Amazing Grace during the eulogy for the 9 Charleston victims at the Emanuel AME Church. So he did everything he could afterward, even though he bore no responsibility whatsoever to make the situation better for the actual victims. Expect nothing like that from Donald Trump. So 3 examples there, if you could call them examples, none of them absolve him of the responsibility he has to come to grips with the sort of movement that he and others like him are leading in this country. Now, beyond Donald Trump, you also had Kellyanne Conway going out and attempting to both sides it and divert from responsibility for what's actually going on. In this particular case with the synagogue shooting, as you'll see.
The anti-religiosity in this country, that it's somehow in vogue and funny to make fun of anybody of faith, to constantly be making fun of people who express religion, the late night comedians, the unfunny people on TV shows. It's always anti-religious. And remember, these people were gunned down in their place of worship, right, as were the people in South Carolina several years ago. And they were there because they're people of faith, and it's that faith that needs to bring us together. This is no time to be driving God out of the public square. No time to be making fun of people. That's right.
Okay, so right there you saw Kellyanne Conway doing what she is paid to do, tell vicious, vicious lies and distract us from actually solving the problems that she purports to address. So again, she brought up the shooting at that church, and she's tying it also to the synagogue shooting. I guess we're supposed to believe that Stephen Colbert is responsible for that, for mocking religion, which she was alluding to. He is, of course, very religious himself, which is ridiculous. They didn't go into that church and shoot it up because Dylan Roof really didn't like religion. Tree of Life Synagogue wasn't shot up because that guy didn't like religion. They loved religion. They loved their own religion. They just didn't like those brands of it. They liked Christianity, but Dylan Roof didn't like black Christians. And this guy sure loved, in Pittsburgh, he liked Christianity. He didn't like Jews. That's the problem. This is not a problem with anti-religiosity. This is a problem with white supremacists and anti-Semites. And so That's very easy to, we can see which groups are anti-Semites, we can see which groups are white supremacists. They don't want that. They don't want you identifying the actual virulent, violent strains of right-wing thought in this country. They want to cloud the issue with anti-religiosity. Because if you can get it to be about that, then it's not a right-wing thing at all. Hell, any secular person, any atheist could be tied in with that. But are there secular people going around committing terrible, violent acts on a daily basis? Is that the problem that we actually have in this country? Is it that atheists that are going around and just targeting random religious people? Is that what America is facing right now? No, of course it's not. White supremacy, anti-Semitism, two things that are tied very closely together and that have levels of hatred, sorts of hatred that are not being stoked by both sides. It is one side very specifically willing to tolerate and encourage that sort of thought and that sort of violence. Thank you very much for watching this clip from The Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.